Symposium with Ash Orlak.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Symposium. Today I'm delighted to start a brand new series on art, and today I'm happy to be joined by one of my oldest friends, Kayla, who is currently he's just graduated from university doing history, but he's developed a strong passion for art and specifically painting. And I'm happy to bring him on today so we can talk about some of the work he's done, some of the people who inspired him, what his work means to him, and we can delve more deeply into some of his art. For all the pieces that we're kind of going to talk about, please do look at his Instagram page. It's KQ Huang Art, which is KQHUANGART, no spaces or punctuation, on Instagram. And yeah, you'll find some of his pieces and that we'll be engaging with if you just want to have a visual representation of the kind of content we're talking about. But yeah, without further ado, Kayla, how are you?
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. Thanks for having me on. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, and I'm really happy. I'm really excited because I'm always excited when we do a brand new series, and this one specifically got me excited because one of the ideas I had for starting the pod, beyond just kind of indulging, I guess, my own egotistical desire to hear my own voice, is to have my friends on there to talk about some of the stuff that interests me about them, and to talk about some of the stuff that they do that's interesting. Which I think other people find interesting as well. And then this is a prime candidate. I think you were one of the people I had in mind when I created the pod as someone that I'd want to talk to about what you're doing, because I'd always admired your artistic ability for a long time, and obviously that's only increased given how you're formally now in my opinion, a proper artist given the kind of pieces you've done. But yeah, talk to me. How did you get into painting? Have you? Is it something you've always done since you were a child? And why is it painting?
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. It's a very kind introduction. So by way of introduction, I'm a third generation British Chinese, and I'm an artist really trying to explore the cultural identity and heritage of the Chinese diaspora, or at least that's what it says on my Instagram bio. But I'm interested in exploring my own experience of being British Chinese. I'm not representing anyone other than myself, but hopefully some of the themes I explored do resonate across the British Chinese community, the Chinese diaspora, and hopefully even amongst other minority groups, because I'm focusing on themes such as integration and questioning a cultural identity, really. But I call myself an artist not because I'm professional or earn money from it, but I think calling myself an artist is important for me because it motivates me, but also focuses my mind really on the persistence and discipline that I feel I need in order to create. But you asked me sort of when did I get into art?
Yeah,
I come from quite an artistic family. My dad's an architect.
Oh, okay.
So we've got art all over the house, really. I remember I used to go to my friends' houses when I was younger. And like, where's your art on the walls? Like, where's your art? So I used to go to museums and galleries a lot with my dad. And I've always been making art. And that's usually painting just because it's most accessible. Like all you need is canvas and paints. But I've only really recently been thinking about sort of sharing my art, going public, if you like. And it's, I guess, only recently during this pandemic lockdown, I've sort of had the time to invest to do that. And I think that's probably because of two reasons, really. Firstly, the lockdown has given us, that time to be able to invest in something that perhaps would be shoved to one side usually. And I think that there's this great quote by Sandra Oh, who plays, the actress from Killing Eve.
Yes.
She says,
she's very good.
Yeah. She says creativity comes from stillness. And the more I understand it, the more I realize that you have to work on it. And I just think that's so true. Like a lot of times people say, I'm not strong, but you can go to the gym and work on your strength. And I think creativity is sort of a similar thing. It's something that can be trained. And I think definitely like over this lockdown period, having the time to be more creative and think about ideas and paint really has sort of, I guess, grown my creativity in that way. So I think...
Is it kind of exercising it kind of like a muscle?
Yeah, I think so. I think, the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah.
I guess I dislike that idea when people just say I'm not creative, when I think it's something that you can, train yourself to do and be.
I find that really interesting as a point of view, just because a lot of people perceive creativity to be something either you have or you don't. You're born with it or you're not. It's kind of like, inherent speed when running. But you given, an interesting and a very encouraging perspective that it is something you can exercise and increase. And I guess the question then arises, I know that you're musically proficient as well. Your violinist. I mean, I play the violin as well. And you've been exposed to a lot of other different types of art forms as well. So why is it that you chose to channel this creativity through painting? And why is it for you that painting is the best medium or the most convenient, or whatever reason you have? Why is painting? Why not ceramics? Why not music?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that, like you say, is convenience. Like it's sort of difficult to create sculpture when you're just at home, whereas all you need is paints and canvas.
Yeah.
To paint, right? But it's also, I've like I say, I've grown up going to museums and galleries and appreciating art. So there's that about it. There's also something. So Yinka Shonobari, who we might get onto later, is one of my favorite artists, and I like what he says about his art. He says it's really the vessels for his ideas and the best method really for transmitting those ideas. And I think it's a similar thing with my painting. If I can sort of express myself and my ideas, and sort of with the concept being almost the more important thing, if I can express that well through painting, then what I sort of enjoy doing. And also the process, I do just enjoy painting really and making art.
So is painting kind of just for you? So it started off as a convenience thing, but it's evolved into perhaps a medium that does, genuinely allow you to channel your creativity in a really effective way.
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, I guess the idea comes first, and then the medium second. It's kind of quite Duchampian, if you like, with Duchamp's idea, the conceptual art. So I guess the idea comes first, and then the medium second. So if a mixed media piece would better represent my art, that's probably what I would do. But at the moment, I'm just in a period, I guess, where I've been doing a lot more painting. Yeah.
So if you were, let's say, in a gallery situation, as you might be next year, or when you resume your studies, then you might decide to branch out of painting. And what kind of areas would you be looking to go into further?
Yeah, so I guess when you have the idea, that comes first. You have a huge range of possibilities open to you. If you can put that out in a mixed media format, there's artists, creating video installation work, sculpture in all sorts of forms. So I think that's quite exciting, the fact that there's so much out there, and if you have access to it, there's a world of possibilities out there to make all sorts of different art to get your point and ideas across.
So you say you started from an idea. Could you explain more concretely what that is? So is it just a very basic concept, as the concept of the Chinese diaspora, or is it, I'm doing a portrait today of my father who is specifically from the Chinese diaspora? Like, how specific is this idea?
Yeah. So I say I'm exploring the cultural identity and heritage of the Chinese diaspora. And I mentioned the first thing about one of the first reasons why I've sort of gone public with my art is just over the lockdown I have time to invest in it. But the second reason really is this long-term push I'm seeing at the moment for cultural diversity, highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, at the moment, the best artists in the world are Black artists because they really have something to say.
Right.
And I think that's great for, the art industry as a whole, because it opens the doors for so many different perspectives and new voices.
Yeah.
And in the UK, at least, the population is about 80%, 81% white, but arts audiences themselves are 92% white. So it's sort of about bridging and closing that gap. And it became sort of clear to me as I went to more museums and art galleries and heard this sort of clamour for more cultural diversity in the arts, that there was this and is this distinct lack of Asian representation in the cultural sphere. And I guess what that really does is it can be quite dangerous because it opens this vacuum for fear mongering and misrepresentation. I saw the racism that happened towards the British Chinese community during the pandemic.
Yeah,
I think there is this sort of almost presumed passivity amongst the British Chinese community. We're not a big community by any means. I don't think we do a lot to help ourselves, and we're sort of labelled the invisible minority because, we're not really visible in culture or in politics.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm part of the Indian British community, and I'd say we're probably more visible. I mean, we're more in number, but I think we're slightly more visible than the Chinese community. But I guess similarly, just from an Asian broader perspective, I think we're both similarly underrepresented in kind of at least fine arts or the kind of art that people when you ask someone about art on the street, I feel that they're imagining Renaissance paintings in galleries. Yeah. And I feel like in that context, most minority communities are underrepresented. Yeah. So I guess the next question is, Could you expand further on why you'd want to why your subject is the Chinese diaspora, and secondly, how you think that relates to perceptions of art by the average person, perhaps as something which is not for them, or something which is of the upper white classes. At least that's a perspective that a lot of people have of art in society.
I mean, just dealing with that last point, the fact that, I mean, perhaps art is seen as something that's, you've got to be highly privileged to take part in.
Yes,
and
exactly.
When you go to art and galleries, you see people who are, middle class, upper class, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the benefits of having something like Instagram. I think, Instagram has huge problems. We know all about the mental health problems. But when it comes to something like sharing art, what I've sort of witnessed, just like in recent months when I've got more involved and started following more art accounts, is that there is so much out there. There's so many people who are, trying to push new voices into the art industry and have something to say. So I think something like Instagram is a great platform, and an equalizing platform sort of for people to push their voices out. And I hope what we'll see, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, with more black artists getting representation in galleries, is that sort of transition from Instagram to your institutional cultural museum spaces. Yeah. But I think, so coming back to what I want to say about the Chinese diaspora. So one hand, I'm interested in reaching out to a more general audience. Like I say, this lack of Asian representation in the cultural sphere, sort of reaching out to people and show them my experience, and hopefully, especially other minorities, what I say will resonate with them. But I guess I'm also interested in actually reaching out to the British Chinese community and the Chinese diaspora itself, and sort of encouraging people, I guess, to reconnect with their Chinese culture and their cultural heritage, a lot of which I feel is deeply ingrained and almost unconscious in how we've raised and the values we've been taught. So I think what happens a lot of the time is, you grow up in a Western country, and what you do is you sort of resist. You resist Chinese culture, you resist the culture of your parents because you want to integrate, and that's sort of natural, right? But then, so I'll illustrate it using this story of a guy called William Yang. He's a third generation Chinese Australian photographer.
Right.
And he basically, he felt Australian. He identified his feelings of living and identifying with Australians. But then the fact is that he looks very different, right? Yeah. And so he calls it like the tyranny of appearance. The fact that, he wants to be Australian and he feels Australian, but he fundamentally looks different. And the values that he's been brought up with, things like the food he's eaten at home, are different from other Australians. Yeah. And I think that term, the tyranny of appearance, sort of captures it very well. But I think...
No, I think I definitely relate, obviously. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was saying what's more interesting to me is that how he actually later discovers, when he gets older, he discovers and studies Chinese philosophy and art. And he describes visiting China, so this is back in the 1980s, as a really powerful experience for him. And I think the story of William Yang sort of captures this idea of the born-again Chinese who sort of recover their lost heritage and sort of come to embrace actually their cross-cultural experience. Yeah. And the fact that it's a positive thing that they have, an understanding of multiple cultures. Yeah. I think that sort of journey from sort of resisting Chinese culture and then coming back to recover it and want to sort of embrace it more is one I've certainly experienced. And I think it's not experienced by everyone, but I think it does resonate with a lot of people I know in sort of the British Chinese community. I mean, you yourself come from two cultures, being just Indian. I guess, what is your relationship with India and Indian heritage?
My relationship with kind of India it's quite similar to William Yang's, as you said. I mean, I grew up, eating. So the thing is, I'm third generation as well. So my parents were born in the UK as well, and my grandparents they came here in 1960s. So they fully, they can pretty much speak English as well. So if I kind of, in certain ways, I'm not really, beyond the way I look, I don't really retain a lot of that classic Indian culture you might see from someone who was a more kind of recent arrival. Sure. But what I do have, as William Yang kind of said, is I do have this idea. Obviously, I look very different, and I obviously ate some different food to some other people. Yeah. But I guess it's about kind of Indian and Chinese culture, which I guess you can relate with, is that, especially from the food perspective, there are kind of pale Anglo imitations of our food in the takeaway kind of sector.
Sure.
So although like we have, the food that you and I ate at home, that would probably be quite different to the kind of food that people would associate as being Indian or Chinese in the kind of Friday night restaurant that someone might go to in the UK.
Yeah.
So that kind of mirrors my overall cultural identity in the sense that my perception of what it is to be Indian as a person was something which was not really relatable to people who aren't really from that joint British Asian community or just from the Asian community, in that their ideas of what it is to be Indian, just like their ideas of Indian food are kind of slightly different. I wouldn't say warped, but just slightly different, kind of almost anglicized versions, pale imitations of the real thing. So when I did go to India, I found it to be quite an enlightening experience going to parts where things you take for granted in the UK are you just merely don't have there, such as hot water from taps and stuff like that, where essentially that leads to a completely different lifestyle because you approach life in a completely different way without the same necessities. And then in contrasting, the massive metropolis cities, which I guess illustrate the future of global kind of prominence, which I'm sure you can relate to with China. So yeah, I mean, how did you feel about? I mean, I'm sure you relate on a lot of those points with your Chinese identity, just because the British and Chinese communities in the Indian and Chinese communities in the UK, I think, share a lot of these kind of issues. And I know you visited China, I think, 3 years ago. So, I mean, that must have impacted you in your art.
Yeah, for sure. I think you sort of mentioned that there's a sort of hybrid culture where you don't feel fully, perhaps you don't feel fully British, or perhaps you don't feel fully Indian or Chinese.
Yeah, you're somewhere in the middle.
When you go back to like India, some people perhaps feel alienated because they don't feel like they belong there. But for me, I think it was pretty powerful, especially when you think of, we talked about food, which plays a big role, and you eat the food of Shanghai or whatever, and then just like understanding that this is a place where I've heard all these stories about, and I think it's powerful in that sense. So I would say it was a pretty powerful experience for me, and sort of captured that cross-cultural experience where, for me, it wasn't a completely alienating thing, but I thought it was quite a positive thing where I could understand a good deal of Chinese culture. Obviously, there were problems with language and things because I'm essentially illiterate, right?
Yeah.
In Chinese. But knowing that, I have this ability to understand a good deal of Chinese culture and also British culture is a pretty positive thing.
I mean, for me, there was that kind of issue where I felt, I'm sure you relate again, because we're both third generation Asians in Britain.
Yeah.
In the sense that sometimes you do feel lost in between both cultures. So when you're in Britain, you still don't look British.
Yeah.
And then or you don't look white. And then when you go to India or China, although you might look kind of more like the people there, you retain, substantially, like, most of your characteristics and everyday kind of actions are European and British. Your primary language is British, so it's kind of like you don't fit in either place.
Exactly. I think, without wanting to sound too intellectual and bring up Homi Bhabha, who
go on.
But he basically says, you occupy this third space basically in between, sort of this interstitial space where your identity lies in between these sort of two nationalities. But I guess the sort of idea I want to put across is that that's not a bad thing. It can be quite an empowering thing, and a really positive thing, because you have this ability to understand your cultures, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so, and I think your art then is art as a general medium is quite important, you'd say, for that kind of communication of culture.
Yeah, definitely. These sort of ideas of wanting to reconnect with my Chinese heritage plays a big part, sort of in my art. Definitely is one of the key ideas, I guess, in that.
So how did you visiting China then really impact you specifically, and what other artists have you come across that really inspired you?
I'd say probably visiting China was powerful for me, but in terms of my art from a sort of British Chinese perspective, probably would be quite similar if I hadn't visited China 3 years ago, I guess, because
right.
I still feel that I've been brought up in Britain with different values, perhaps to my friend, eating different food, those kind of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I'm talking about different artists, I guess I mentioned earlier that I think the best artists working at the moment are Black artists. So I actually identify a lot with other Black artists who are exploring issues of race, history, and cultural identity, right? Because I think perhaps largely that's because there are so few Asian artists working on those issues. Certainly not that you would see in museums and galleries. I know on Instagram there are plenty, but really eminent artists. And I mentioned Yinka Shonibare earlier. He's one of my favorite artists. So just to introduce him, he is a British Nigerian artist who explores issues of race and class and sort of questions our notions of authenticity. So he was born in London, I think, and then went back to Lagos and then came back to study in London. And when he was studying, one of his professors basically said to him, "Why aren't you making African art?" Which, we think about that now, that's a really prejudiced thing to say.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a prejudiced assumption. Yeah.
But it got him thinking, right? What is African art? And so through thinking about that, he sort of found this batik fabric. And if you've seen any of Yinka Shonibare's work, you'll know that batik fabric is a key sort of medium that he uses, key fabric. And so it's all that colourful fabric that most people generally associate with Africa. If you go to Lagos, see markets where people are selling these fabrics, right? But Shonibare made this discovery that, these are actually Indonesian fabrics. So they originate in Indonesia, but they were produced by the Dutch East India Company.
Wow,
and then introduced to the West African market. So the idea of authenticity is then completely blurred.
Yes.
Because, the fabric is not originally African, but it has sort of been assimilated into this sort of cliched African cultural identity.
Almost like him being assimilated into the British identity.
Yeah, I guess so as well, because you look at him and you wouldn't know he's British Nigerian. You might just assume he's black, he's African.
Yeah.
But he questions, he urges the viewer to ask, at what point does it become, authentically African? And it kind of builds into, there's no such real thing as authenticity, because authenticity is all about purity of origin, right? And nothing completely pure in origin.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting statement, just because I find some of the debate around cultural identity and almost racial identity slightly asinine, or just unwelcome, in the sense that beyond its kind of divisive nature, although it's important to obviously know and respect where you came from and know your own identity, as you and I are, as you've explored in your art, and as I've said as well, some of it is slightly arbitrary in that I feel like there are a lot more things in common between people in the world than there are different, and you'll often find that you're far less connected to a place than you thought you were, just because your own kind of, just because everyone eventually kind of came from the same place. And you can make arbitrary decisions about how many years you want to go back to decide where you're from. But at the end of the day, I feel that there is a lot more. I feel like that is, although it's obviously important to recognize cultural and quaint things, the kind of divisive consequences of that, I think, are important to at least be aware of.
No, I do agree. I think cultural identity is not the be all and end all. I'm a Christian. I believe that there's much more to who you are than just your cultural identity.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can deny that it's quite important to a lot of people understand themselves.
Yes, exactly.
And I guess, it comes back to what art is. Like Bruce Lee, who's unfortunately been caricatured into this sort of martial arts kicking guy, but actually he was a great philosopher and he wrote a lot. And he identified art as the expression of the self, right? And it's where you're projecting this inner vision into a world without. And for me, sort of that inner vision, and what makes up a lot of myself, I guess, is that cultural identity. So that, I don't think it's the be all and end all, but I do think it can be arbitrary, but I do think it makes up a lot of how people see and understand themselves. Yeah.
So I know, I think that's really valuable. So I mean, you've spoken then about the kind of things that inspired you, why it's precisely painting, why you're talking about the Chinese diaspora. So I think it's now an opportune time to just jump into some specific pieces that are on your Instagram. As I said, I'll link it in the description of the video on YouTube and in the Spotify description for the episode. Let's just jump into some pieces. So the first one I'd like to engage with is one that I remember you painting 3 years ago. And it was it's Father oil on canvas, which is a beautiful canvas painting of your father. Just describing to listeners, he's wearing a kind of blue shirt with buildings in a kind of cubic style in the background that I assume he's kind of had a part in designing. The background is a lively horizontal brushed green and kind of turquoise color. sorry, a green and kind of lime green color with some lower, darker blues that really bring out the kind of colors of Kayla's father's face in the foreground. So yeah, Kayla, talk to us about this piece. Why did you paint it? What does it mean to you? How were you inspired to paint it?
Yeah, I mean, well, this piece is, the first point out, it's not really to do with the Chinese diaspora. It's sort of just a painting of my dad, really.
Right.
So I mean, this piece was created at the end of sort of the IB, right, when I was studying visual art. So I was investigating,
Yes, I remember.
color and form and geometry, especially in portraits. So this was sort of the culmination of that. Painting a picture of my dad, who's an architect. So I included some of his architectural drawings in the background. I mean, I sort of included that on my Instagram because it's a nice painting, right? But I guess it's not completely connected to. I guess I sort of moved on and developed my understanding of what I want to do with my art,
Yeah.
which I guess you can see later. But yeah, that piece is really just a combination of that where I was at that time studying at school.
No, okay, that's really interesting. So let's actually move on to then one of the Chinese diaspora paintings, which is, let's start with the first one, which is Portrait Collage Johnny, which is a paper collage and acrylic on canvas.
Yeah.
And it basically, to describe it to listeners, it's quite hard to describe, but it's essentially a picture of a Chinese man with a collage of essentially Chinese takeaway menus on his face, interspersed with beautiful red and black patterns. Kayla, I'm sure you can do a better job of describing it than I can. Please talk to me about it.
Yeah, so it's a collage portrait of one of my friends called Johnny. He's a British Chinese guy, and he's the portrait is made of basically, like you said, Chinese takeaway leaflets. So we talked earlier about how important food is really to the diaspora, to both to the Indian diaspora and to the Chinese diaspora.
Yeah.
That work sort of came about by me thinking, there's this really high proportion of the British Chinese population involved in the food industry. There's a long history of, Chinese takeaways in this country. My granddad moved to Britain from Guangdong in South China in the 1970s, and he set up a Chinese restaurant. And he's very keen to remind me of how grueling his lifestyle was and the sacrifices he made.
Yeah, similarly.
Yeah, and it's true, very much true. I wouldn't have been able to experience so many of the opportunities I've had.
No, exactly.
Those sacrifices.
Yeah.
But I think frustrating for me was that, takeaways are typically looked down upon, really, as these really dirty and quite unfriendly places. And I think perhaps that's more prevalent in America than in Britain. But I do think the idea does exist here. I think it's ingrained in the idea of, Chinese people, places, and food as sort of dirty, which is, I guess, rooted in the history of the Chinese diaspora and their hard labor jobs in America before they were sort of pushed out to laundry and restaurant businesses.
Yeah.
So the work is, trying to reclaim that pride, I guess, in the community's shared heritage in these restaurants, which, I mean, you mentioned your granddad speaks pretty good English, but my granddad's English is still very poor. So
right. Okay.
Imagine him coming to this country, really. He still doesn't speak very good English at all, really, and he regrets not learning. But it's, he came over by himself first, and then my grandma and my dad came along later. But it's, it's a huge sacrifice, and it's difficult for us now, I know, to try and understand what that must have been like, right? But the college is about sort of reclaiming that pride in what those takeaways sort of stand for, and remove that idea of them being looked down upon, really.
Yeah, I mean, I find that really interesting. So, do you feel that the takeaways and the kind of views that they propagate in society, whether it's about the healthiness of the food or just the kind of cleanness of the places, the kind of stereotypical takeaways not viewed unfavorably, as you say, do you think those kind of views then spilled over into a characterization of the Chinese diaspora in general?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so. I mean, especially in America, where you have the Chinese Exclusion Act. And all sorts of propaganda against Chinese people because they're apparently taking up all the jobs of the American. Yeah. I definitely think it did spill over into these sort of stereotypes that we've seen. Yeah.
So what kind of what are you trying to say with this art and this specific piece there? Because so you have the kind of the collage of the menus and it's interspersed with Johnny's face. So are you kind of trying to say that it actually is a very important part of his identity, but it's not something that he should be ashamed of. It's not something that should be viewed negatively. It should be viewed something as positive and part of the kind of
Mm.
industrious or enterprising nature of the Chinese diaspora.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah,
Take
I mean,
pride, take pride. Should something you should take pride in.
yeah, I think, a lot of Chinese people in the British Chinese community actually grew up in takeaways. I didn't, but I know a lot of people did.
Yeah,
Uh,
similarly.
and they try and shun it. It's like that idea of resistance that we were talking about earlier.
Mm.
But yeah, it's about taking sort of ownership and appreciation of that, and the wider ideas of what those places stand for in terms of the sacrifices of that first wave of immigrants. Really, I mean, I guess what is your sort of view of like Indian takeaways? I don't know if your family were ever
Well,
involved in
so
that.
this is the interesting thing about this. I won't go too long on it, but it's interesting just because so what is actually essentially the basic Indian takeaway you'll find in the UK isn't actually usually run by Indian people. It's usually run by Bangladeshis.
Okay, yeah,
Indians who actually came either were professionals in some way or other and became, worked in the NHS as doctors or um, worked in like the legal professions or whatever kind of professional jobs, or they worked in kind of factories doing hard labor, and a lot of them obviously founded, corner shops and clothes shops.
yeah,
My grandfather on one side did a clothes shop after doing hard labor and being anything from a bus conductor to a pub landlord before that.
yeah.
And then my grandfather on the other side was actually a fully qualified mechanic when he came. So he had
Oh,
skill. So he had skills, and he founded his own garage, and he bought a petrol station franchise on the side.
oh, yeah.
So it's all kind of it's very entrepreneurial. Very few of them actually I find work in the public sector
Mm,
other than in medicine. Other
okay,
than in medicine,
yeah,
and they ended up a lot of them founding as a Chinese diaspora did businesses.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, it's interesting just because I guess food restaurants are central to the kind of Chinese diaspora in the UK, but they're kind of not to the Indian diaspora in the sense that they're run usually by people from Bangladesh anyway.
oh, sure,
And a lot of Indians I know actually never really go to an Indian restaurant at all. They just much rather eat at home.
yeah,
So that's the kind of differences, I suppose. But I guess the point in general about your kind of job or kind of racial or kind of discriminatory stereotypes about your community being kind of bled over from your job, I guess, do kind of apply to the Indian community in the same way in the regards to their labor jobs and the kind of accommodation that they were living in.
hmm,
But then in other ways they don't, because obviously they occupied some positions of respectability like medicine, which I guess leads to some differences between the communities. But I mean, I really applaud what you're doing with this specific art, just in about ensuring kind of pride in where you came from. And I think that the first wave of whatever immigrants, really, whether it be the Afro-Caribbeans, Chinese, or the Indians who came, or
yeah,
any of the South Asians who came in the 1960s and 70s, the kind of Windrush generation, they all worked very hard and grafted away so that their children would be better off. And I think children of those immigrants, as you and I and millions of others, ought to be mindful of that and respectful of that. So yeah, I'm massively grateful to to all four of my grandparents for kind of what they've done for me.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, moving on, I think is you've done this collage I think 3 times. The second one was called Lucy.
yeah.
Um, are there any kind of differences here that you would like to highlight? Johnny is kind of more interspersed with red background, heavily red on the face. Lucy is more kind of bluish, with some red interspersed. Are there any kind of specific creative choices behind that?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things at play here. One is sort of the Chinese takeaway leaflets. The other is sort of these Beijing opera masks, which is
Right.
much more prevalent in sort of the work you see later. The opera masks
Mm.
portraits, but it's sort of the colors and the patterns used in the masks of traditional Chinese opera. So just as like a side note, I just really like Chinese opera. I think it combines music, singing, acrobatics, martial arts. It's not very well known in the West, but it's also got these brilliant costumes, and they basically paint these sort of colorful masks on their face when they perform.
Mm.
And so this sort of motif of these opera masks is something that I'm really interested in, because I use it just to kind of show two things. Firstly, how the British Chinese are sort of somewhat this invisible minority. The fact that they're sort of hidden behind a mask, that
Yeah.
you look at a Chinese person, you have no idea if he's, just by looking, right, whether he's British, Chinese, or whatever, and you're just simply assumed to be Chinese because of the way you look.
Yes.
And I think it's easy to feel quite uncomfortable with that. But I think there is a point where, you start to see it as a positive thing. Like I was saying, you're a hybrid of two cultures.
Mm.
So that's the first thing. I think the second thing I wanted to suggest really is, this inclination of British Chinese people to sort of reconnect with their Chinese heritage, and embrace Chinese culture, which you mentioned earlier. And I think sort of, the opera masks, they sort of, to me, represent, so I use them to sort of represent Chinese culture. They're a very traditional form of Chinese performance. They've been performed since sort of ancient times, have a long history, and they're still performed in China today.
So does the mask kind of represent then the anonymity of the Chinese in Britain?
Yeah, that's one of the ways I use it. It's sort of like a mask, really, to hide behind. And well, I guess there's a sense in which the British Chinese community have sort of hidden behind it, right? Because we haven't. I don't think we've really pushed ourselves out there in terms of culture, in terms of politics, and many other fields. But also this fact that we are just hidden because of the way we look.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. And I guess that kind of links to, I mean, I really recommend again that you look at Kayla's Instagram here. It's really magnificent. But
Exactly.
no, just because of what I'm about to say, in that the paintings themselves of the takeaway collages, the kind of takeaway menus act as a mask on the faces, which might also show that the kind of Chinese community are being hidden behind these kind of stereotypes based on a job that a lot of them do. And then the stereotypes of the kind of job that they do, i.e. that, as you say, the poor reputation that takeaways may hold, are then used to mask, the true kind of more positive characteristics that Chinese people have. And the takeaway menus are acting as a mask, just as the Chinese opera masks are acting as masks.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful insight, Ashwin. Yeah, that the takeaways really, the leaflets make up those masks. So yeah, it does suggest that those stereotypes are, contributing to that idea of the Chinese community being sort of hidden and being looked down upon, really, because they're associated with these stereotypically dirty places, right?
Well, I mean, the next painting I'd like to talk about is acrylic on canvas, which is Opera Mask Family. So in this painting, Kayla has on the right painted a essentially just a Chinese opera mask, and on the left is a kind of face interspersed with Chinese characters. It's less kind of vivid, except for most of the painting is less vivid than the kind of earlier works with the collages, except for the Chinese mask itself, which is the most vivid, and it's almost shiny, luminescent, which kind of again shows to me the idea that that's what people see, that kind of mask, rather than the person hiding behind it, who is much less visible, almost looks like it's being drawn by pencil at some areas. So could you please talk to me about kind of this piece and what it means for you, and especially the idea of family?
Yeah, so I guess there's three elements to this painting. There's the mask, the portrait, and then the Chinese calligraphic character.
Yeah.
And like you say, I painted the mask in a much bolder way to sort of suggest what I've been saying about the mask, how it's, like what you're saying, like this is what people see, and to use it as a motif to encourage people to reconnect with the Chinese heritage. And then you've got the portrait of the young boy who is British Chinese, and then the calligraphic character. And I sort of used the calligraphy just to highlight other elements of Chinese culture that I feel have been carried over into the Chinese diaspora, sort of cultural baggage. And I think, a lot of that cultural baggage is unconscious. It's just in the values that we've grown up with. And might never sort of acknowledge it, perhaps. But I think I have, just because, meeting other people at university, of course, you meet so many different people.
Yeah.
Realize, the values that you have can be so different from the way other people have grown up and been sort of educated, perhaps. So just that character itself means family. And I think just on that, family just plays the central role in Chinese culture and Chinese society, possibly more than in Britain. I think it's well symbolized by, in Chinese naming, you place the family name, the surname in English first in Chinese. So my Chinese name, Huang Qilei, Huang is my family name.
Yeah.
So first of all, you're part of a family. Rather than being seen as just this individual, you're part of a family.
That's so interesting. I've not thought of the reordering like in that sense before, but I guess it really shows the value perhaps of Chinese family to your identity.
Yeah, I think There's this very communal sense to Chinese culture. You're part of this wider family, and within that, a hierarchy.
Yeah.
The Chinese historian, the historian of China, actually an Indian historian of China, right?
Oh, okay.
Rana Mitter, right?
Right. Yeah.
He says, the Chinese language has no straight word for brother or sister, right?
Right.
Instead, you are a Jie, which is an older sister, a Mei Mei, a younger sister, a Ge, an older brother, or a Didi, which is a younger brother.
Right.
So it's all about this hierarchy within the family relationships and the fact that those are sort of central. And I think a lot of that is, rooted on Confucianism.
Mm.
We're talking about Chinese culture and society. We can't avoid talking about Confucianism, right? Because even though perhaps some people see that as a very archaic sort of form of moral guidance, it still plays, I think, a big role in the values of Chinese society, and comes across in that cultural baggage in which, I've certainly grown up with, and in which the Chinese diaspora, I think a lot of them grow up with this values of Confucianism, one of which is, filial piety, which in itself is sort of the sacrificial respect for your elders, right?
Yes. No, and does that then link? Sorry if this comes across as ignorant. Obviously, I don't know much about this, but does it link to the ideas of ancestor worship and or even while your ancestors are living, just during your lives being perhaps a more kind of subservient and just very respectful in a way that is quite apparent in Indian culture, but perhaps less so to your elders in European culture?
Yeah, definitely. I think filial piety is definitely connected with ancestor worship for sure. Actually, when I went back to China, this was about 5 years ago, maybe even more, but I went to my granddad's hometown. So the granddad who came here and set up a restaurant, right? And we basically went to do ancestor worship, which, I'm a Christian, so I just did it sort of for the fun of it, really. But so we climbed up this mountain and you let off all these firecrackers. And it took us quite a long time to get up this mountain, right? And we let off pretty much 90% of the firecrackers.
Wow.
Right? And they're really loud, incredibly loud. I was quite frightened at the time. I think it was more than 5 years ago. I was quite young. But basically, as we were letting off the firecrackers, they realized that we were at the wrong grave. So it was just be worshipping. Well, I don't know if it's worshipping. I think it's more paying respect to
someone else's ancestors.
and then we went. I think we finally got to the right grave, and then there weren't many firecrackers left. So poor guy in his grave was like, can't have been too pleased.
No,
our efforts.
No, that's quite a beautiful and quite funny story. I know. I think I'm really interested in this idea of the kind of indivisible unit. So traditional Western, especially kind of Anglo-Saxon thought and kind of classical liberalism would suggest that the indivisible unit is the individual, like as a sovereign person, looking at ideas from John Locke and John Stuart Mill. But what's kind of in kind of Indian and now I know Chinese culture, the indivisible unit is the family unit, the nuclear family, usually parents and kids, or sometimes even 3 generations, and quite frequently 3 generations, which is why you get kind of multi-generational households in Asian cultures. I just find it very interesting about how that is kind of how those ideas compare and contrast, because they do influence very heavily the way you behave. And that if your kind of primary unit of concern is yourself and just yourself, I think inevitably, for better or for worse, you'll behave differently to someone whose primary concern includes, 3 or 4 other people at least. And those other 3 or 4 other people might be, very similar to you. They're your closest people in the world, but they're still other people. And the fact that they are other people and still part of this indivisible unit means that you can never exist alone, which is one, I think, interesting concept. And secondly, that every action you take thinking about those other people.
I think that's so true. I think a great way we've seen that really with mask wearing over the sort of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
You go to pre-COVID Japan. Of course, Japan is very much rooted in Confucianism, brought over from China.
Yes.
You would have seen most people wearing masks, right? Because mask wearing is to look out and care for and help other people primarily, isn't it? And in the UK, we haven't been very good with mask wearing really. And then you look at the figures, and Japan has a population twice the size of the UK, but has 45 times less deaths. So I think
and far more very old people as well, who you think would be more kind of vulnerable.
Yeah, but I do think just mask wearing does actually illustrate that point quite well. The fact that it's that sort of sacrificial element of looking out for the community rather than just looking after yourself. Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting. So just moving on to kind of your second last piece that I want to talk about, it's Opera Mask Courage. So again, we have an opera mask on the right, which is very vivid, versus the less vivid face on the left. The opera mask on the right this time is not black, red, and white, but is kind of black, red, and white, but with with like blue interspersed as well, and a slightly different kind of pattern to the family mask. The face obviously on the left is slightly different, and the Chinese character is again interspersed, but again something different. I assume it means courage.
Yeah.
Could you talk about this piece and how courage relates to Confucianism, as you've written in the Instagram description there?
Yeah. So I guess courage. Confucius himself in the Analects didn't really talk that much about courage.
Right.
It was picked up a lot by philosophers Mencius and Shunzi, who, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but they both praise courage as this virtue of great men and noble characters.
So, you mean the art of war?
No. It's
right.
Xunzi.
Right.
So yeah, not Sun Tzu, but a different philosopher really.
Yeah.
So Confucius courage, I guess, does play a big part in Chinese culture, especially visual culture, because in Chinese visual culture you have these popular motifs of the tiger and the lion, very much associated with courage. And I guess what I didn't include in that little description is also the courage it takes. We talked about that first wave of immigrants coming across. I guess this is also about the courage for them to make that move and to come across to a completely new country. So I guess multiple meanings in that as well. Yeah.
So does that kind of then link to perhaps the ideas you spoke about earlier of, as you said, coming to a new country, but then perhaps being even after you arrive, surviving in what would be quite difficult existence at the start and being quite enterprising?
I definitely think so. Yeah. I mean, coming to a new country without knowing the language, trying to interact with people. My granddad would tell me, how he saw all these fights happening in the Chinese restaurants.
Yeah.
It's not always an accommodating experience.
No. So did your grandfather, is it quite an important part of Chinese identity to aspire to be one of these noble characters that are demonstrated in the kind of Confucian philosophy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it depends who you ask, really.
Right.
I'm not sure I'm the best place to talk about that, but
I mean, you could talk about your own experience, I guess, that with the most authority.
My idea of Confucian values is more to do with respect for one's elders, I would say, over courage. For me, I guess, it hasn't played a huge role, but I'm sure for others, maybe in China itself, it would have played a bigger role. I mean, coming back to Confucianism, I guess it forms a foundation of a lot of value structures in China. I was just wondering, is there a similar sort of value structure in India?
Well, there's the it depends, because India then is very multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
I think it's quite different to China in that regard, because in China you have a lot of the Han Chinese who dominate the kind of overall population.
Yeah.
And you do have some minorities, but India is genuinely very ethnically diverse. It's not really a singular country. It's actually a lot of countries just stitched together. It's only really been a single country for about 170, 180 years. Before that, it's separate princely states, really, with all of their own languages and everything else. So it then depends which part of India you go to have this kind of base identity. So I guess the answer to your question is no.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is obviously the unifying identity of the kind of Vedic culture from 10,000 years ago, which spawned Hinduism, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata, which are the kind of the main books of Hinduism, main stories, which are themselves, ancient Vedic stories based on kind of migrants who came to India from Ukrainian steppe culture, almost like from the Central Asian plateau, rather than coming from, South India, who were kind of pre-existing Dravidian people. These people arrived in India after those earlier settlers and established Vedic culture, which I guess established things like the caste system, and the stories of the Ramayana, etc., which do influence Indian culture today. But whether we have a kind of singular philosopher like
Sure.
Confucius or even Homer in the Greek context. I don't think so, as far as I'm aware. But these stories, regardless of who they're written by, are all kind of very much the base of the Indian identity, I think, especially if you associate the Indian identity with Hinduism, which I personally don't. I think that's a very dangerous mistake. But if you were to do that and you were to see India as a kind of Hindustan, then that would be the basis of your identity.
Sure.
But I guess that's a kind of interesting contrast.
Yeah. No, sure.
I mean, just the final piece I want to talk about then is actually very aptly enough called respect, because it links to what you've been talking about in terms of respecting your elders was an important part of your experience of Confucian culture.
Yeah.
Obviously, this one is similar to the others in that it has a vivid mask on the right with this time pink, black and white with vivid red lips. And there's an elderly Chinese lady on the left, again interspersed with Chinese characters, obviously slightly less vivid than the mask due to the reasons that we've kind of said. So yeah, Kayla, talk to me about this. This links to what you said about being the most important aspects of Confucianism to you.
Yeah. I mean, so that portrait is actually of my grandma, who came over after my granddad,
Right.
Who set up the Chinese restaurant. And yeah, so yeah, I guess the ideas of respect do kind of tie up what we've been talking about. Respect in terms of a filial piety, that respect, that dutiful and sort of sacrificial respect for your elders.
Yes.
I think respect also, and I mentioned this in the description, also conveys this idea of face. Now, face is like a really complex concept in Chinese culture. It can be, I guess, loosely translated as dignity.
Right.
But it governs a lot of Chinese social interactions. So it's sort of the respect and you pay someone. And it's quite difficult to express. We don't have anything really in British culture, certainly, that's similar.
Right.
But it's sort of the respect you pay someone in a social interaction, and it can be given and lost in a similar way.
And that then links to kind of the idea that you should adhere to this social code that respects your elders and basically, you maintain your own dignity by respecting the dignity of people who are elder and more knowledgeable than you are.
Yeah, for sure. It's again, yeah, that filial piety, that respect for your elders, that I don't think it exists so much in Britain, which is quite a big shame. I'm not saying that people in Britain don't care for the elderly. I mean, that's obviously not true, but just bound up in Chinese culture is this intense duty and sacrificial duty you have to your elders of looking after them. A lot of, just like in a lot of Indian families, the families live together because when the older people live in the same building as the rest of the family. So it's like that duty of care almost that exists in Chinese culture.
I mean, it's a bit of a social taboo. No Indian family I know would ever send their relatives to a care home, for example. I think that would be the ultimate kind of social taboo or disrespect. In the sense that it's usually the son, but the child in general, it's usually their responsibility to look after their parents until their parents die.
Yeah.
And there's this idea of kind of this, it rooted quite a lot in Hindu culture, where you have this family that of middle-aged parents that moved their parents into this kind of shed outside the house, and you have the idea of their grandchild starting to build a structure outside his house, and his parents come home, i.e. the children of the grandparents outside come in, the grandson's parents, they come in and they say to the son or the child, what are you doing? What are you building? And he said, well, I'm building your shed where you're going to live when you're old. And his parents are horrified. Then that links to the idea that you should kind of look after your parents until they die. It's linked in very much to a sense of duty that I guess isn't really found anymore in the West after this. The closest I think I can find it to is a kind of duty to your state that you find in some parts of the communist culture or some parts of kind of pre-World War I continental imperialist cultures, whether it's Prussia or Austria-Hungary or Russia, those kind of cultures which have an intense duty to the state, where you are willingly conscripted in order to give your life to the state should it be necessary. That kind of intense duty is the only thing I can compare Asian duty to kind of your familial elders, because the kind of familial duty in the same way doesn't exist in the UK. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, it's just different.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything pejoratively. I'm not intending to either.
Sure. Yeah, me neither. I mean, yeah, it's just different. I mean, I think that's what we want to
highlight.
Highlight. Yeah, that the difference between the cultures, because I think something that art can do incredibly well is increase empathy, right? And if you have a curiosity about different cultures and want to understand different cultures, and it's been really interesting hearing about your experience of being British Indian.
No, thank you for asking. I don't really talk about it very much, but I thought, but no, because you asked, I decided to provide my answer.
Yeah, but I think it does increase your empathy and your understanding for other people and where they're coming from. And empathy is something that's just sorely needed in the world at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. Just final word, not related to really your art, just a quick couple of sentences if you could on the best advice you have for someone who feels creativity, feels that they're a creative person feels that they're a creative person that has something to offer. What is the best way for them to kind of engage with that? What's the best way for them to find a medium? What advice do you have for anyone who wants to become an artist but has no idea of how to go about it?
I'm not sure if I'm the best place to give that. I mean, I'm just starting out on my journey. But I think, if you want to be creative, I guess the things I would say is empathy, curiosity, and just a determinism to go for it, right? And creativity is so easy to express. Like I was saying at the moment with Instagram, there's a great platform for sharing art, for being inspired by other people. So, and with museums and galleries starting to reopen, we're so lucky to live. We're so lucky to live in a culture where we have so much freedom to engage in these things. You look at what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment, and I think it just reminds me not to take freedom for granted. I mean, I'll finish on a word by Bruce Lee, one of my heroes, who says, art lives where absolute freedom is, because where it is not, there can be no creativity.
Kayla, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashwin.
I've really enjoyed the chat, and obviously it's very meaningful for me. It's very quite an emotional chat, engaging with myself as well as with you, and it's obviously been a pleasure, and thank you so much, and I'm very happy to do this again whenever you want to. And thank you as well for listening to the Symposium new art series. Delighted to start the series. As you can tell, it's just quite meaningful to those who will be involved in it. And it's exactly what I wanted to do when I started the podcast in terms of engaging with the interesting stuff that my friends do. I thank Kayla again for his time. Again, I'd just like to say that we're on Spotify. The link is in our Instagram bio. And also the link to Kayla's Instagram will be in the description for the YouTube video of this pod. And in the Spotify description for this pod episode. Please do follow the Spotify link. You'll be able to listen to all our episodes, and if you follow that link, you'll see the links to all our other platforms, whether that's YouTube or Google Podcasts or anywhere else. The Instagram is the Symposium Podcast, and it's the same on all the other social medias too. So thank you so much, and see you next time on an episode from the Symposium. Thanks.
The Symposium with Ash Orlak.